The year is 23 years before the birth of Christ, a summer evening in a villa on the Bay of Naples. The house belongs to Marcus Vedius Pollio, a man who was born into nothing and now owns everything, including the 47 slaves who staff this single property among his dozen estates scattered across the Italian peninsula. A young slave named Demetrius stands frozen at the edge of the dining room, a silver wine pitcher trembling in his hands. 3 drops of Falernian wine have just splashed onto the mosaic floor. The droplets are smaller than tears. They will change his life forever. Vedius Pollio has stopped mid-sentence. His dinner guests, 7 of Rome's most powerful senators and their wives, have fallen silent. The only sound is the distant splash of water in the ornamental fish pond that dominates the villa's central courtyard. That fish pond is famous throughout Rome, not for its beauty, for what lives in it. Pollio raises one finger. 2 guards step forward, seizing Demetrius by the arms. The boy does not struggle. He knows struggling makes it worse. He has seen what happens to slaves who spill things in this house. He has heard the sounds from the courtyard on nights when Pollio entertains. He has watched other slaves walk toward that fish pond and not walk back. The pond contains lampreys, moray eels imported from the waters off Sicily, specially bred for size and aggression, kept perpetually hungry, so they will perform when Pollio requires entertainment. The punishment for minor infractions in this household is to be thrown into the pond alive. The eels can strip flesh from bone in minutes. Pollio has timed it. Demetrius is dragged toward the courtyard. He can see the black water ahead, can see the shapes moving beneath the surface, can hear the wet sounds of creatures anticipating food. The dinner guests have risen from their couches to watch. One senator's wife is smiling. Another is looking away, but not leaving, not objecting, not doing anything except bearing witness to what Roman hospitality apparently includes. This is the moment when something unexpected happens. One of the dinner guests steps forward. He is younger than the others, quieter, a man who has spent the evening observing more than speaking. His name is not recorded in the account that survives, but his actions are. He places himself between Demetrius and the pond. He looks at Pollio and says words that no guest should say to a host, words that challenge a wealthy Roman's absolute right over his own property. He says that what is about to happen is wrong. Pollio's face contorts with rage. The guest has violated every rule of Roman social conduct. A man's slaves are his own. What he does with them is no one's business. To interfere is to insult the host's dignity, to question his judgment, to suggest that his entertainment is somehow improper. The confrontation lasts several minutes. Other guests remain frozen, unwilling to support either side. Finally, Pollio makes a decision that reveals something important about Roman elite culture. He releases Demetrius. Not because he agrees that feeding slaves to eels is wrong, because the confrontation has ruined the entertainment. A spectacle requires enthusiastic spectators. A single objection transforms theater into awkwardness. But Pollio does not forget, and Pollio does not forgive. The guest who intervened will face consequences that unfold over years, subtle destructions of reputation and opportunity that cannot be traced back to this evening but originate here. In this moment, when someone suggested that Roman elite entertainment had crossed a line, here is what you need to understand. Vedius Pollio was not considered exceptional among Roman elites. He was not shunned for his lamprey pond. He was not excluded from polite society. He continued hosting dinners attended by Rome's most powerful families. His only mistake in Roman eyes was being too obvious about practices that other wealthy Romans conducted with more discretion. The Roman elite maintained secrets that they systematically erased from official histories. What survived in the historical record is what could be admitted publicly. What did not survive, what was hidden and denied and destroyed, reveals a ruling class whose private practices exceeded anything their public monuments suggest. Tonight, You will learn 17 secrets that Rome's elite tried to bury. Not the crimes of mad emperors, which have been documented extensively, the crimes of ordinary aristocrats. Senators who sat in judgment of others while practicing abominations in their own homes. Matrons celebrated for their virtue who participated in rituals that would have meant death for common citizens. Families whose names represented Roman honor for generations while their private conduct violated every principle they publicly championed. These were not isolated incidents. These were systematic practices maintained across centuries by a ruling class that believed their wealth and status exempted them from the moral standards they imposed on everyone else. The evidence was deliberately destroyed, but fragments survived in unexpected places. Private letters that escaped burning, graffiti preserved by volcanic ash, legal documents that mentioned crimes without describing them fully, archaeological remains that tell stories written records tried to hide. What you are about to hear comes from those surviving fragments, pieces of a puzzle that Roman elites spent centuries trying to ensure would never be assembled. They failed. And tonight, 2,000 years later, their secrets finally come to light. Before we descend into this darkness together, if you value content that exposes the hidden truths of history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below telling me where in the world you are listening from. These stories were buried deliberately by people who had every reason to keep them hidden. They deserve to be heard by everyone willing to confront what lies beneath the marble facades of Roman civilization. Let us begin with what really happened at Roman dinner parties, because the banquet was where elite secrets were both practiced and protected. You have seen depictions of Roman banquets in films and television, reclining figures on couches, servants bringing elaborate dishes, wine flowing freely, civilized conversation among the educated and powerful. These depictions are accurate as far as they go. They simply omit what happened after the formal dinner ended. Roman elite banquets operated on two levels. The official dinner, the cena, followed strict protocols of hospitality. Guests arrived at specific hours. Courses were served in specific sequences. Conversation topics were appropriate for mixed company. This portion of the evening could be discussed publicly, referenced in letters, mentioned in speeches. The second level, the commissatio, began after the main meal concluded. This was the drinking party that followed dinner, and it operated under entirely different rules. What happened during the commissatio was understood to be private. Guests who discussed it publicly violated social codes that could result in permanent exclusion from elite circles. A poet named Martial wrote about commissatio practices in terms that required readers to understand implications rather than explicit statements. He references senators who arrive at dinners with their wives and leave with other arrangements. He mentions matrons whose behavior after the third wine course would shock their morning visitors. He describes scenes witnessed through half-open doors that participants would deny the next day. The practices Martial implies were confirmed by other sources. Seneca wrote philosophical condemnations of banquet behavior that reveal what he was condemning. Pliny the Elder documented what he called the corruption of the dining room in terms that suggest intimate activities occurring among dinner guests as routine entertainment. The mechanics operated through understood signals. Certain gestures indicated availability. Certain responses indicated interest. Certain arrangements of couches facilitated what would follow. Slaves were trained to recognize these signals and to facilitate arrangements without explicit instruction. The entire system functioned through implication rather than statement, allowing participants to maintain the fiction that nothing unusual was occurring. A wealthy widow named Sempronia hosted banquets in the late Republic that became famous for their commissatio entertainment. The historian Sallust, writing about the conspiracy of Catiline, mentions her parties as gathering places for men planning treason. But between the lines of his political narrative, he reveals something else. Sempronia's parties featured what he calls every kind of entertainment, with guests participating in activities that respectable women supposedly never witnessed, much less facilitated. The slave infrastructure supporting these banquets was extensive. Beautiful slaves of both genders were displayed during dinner, their availability understood by all present. Guests could request specific slaves through subtle signals to the host. The slaves themselves had no voice in these arrangements. Their bodies were simply amenities, like the silver dinnerware or the imported wines. What made elite banquets particularly disturbing was the combination of sophistication and exploitation. These were educated people discussing philosophy and poetry and politics, while simultaneously treating other human beings as objects for entertainment. The cognitive dissonance was not experienced as contradiction. It was simply how civilized Romans lived. A fragment from the Satyricon, a novel written during Nero's reign, depicts a banquet at the house of a wealthy freedman named Trimalchio. The scene is satirical, mocking the excesses of the newly rich. But the satire works only because readers recognize the practices being exaggerated. The intimate entertainments, the casual use of slaves, the blurring of boundaries during the drinking hours, these were familiar enough to elite Romans that they could appreciate the comedy. The banquet system persisted for centuries because it served social functions beyond entertainment. Alliances were formed during commissatio. Political deals were sealed. Business arrangements were concluded. The shared participation in private activities created bonds of complicity that made betrayal dangerous. Everyone present had witnessed everyone else. Mutual blackmail potential ensured mutual silence. But the banquets were only one setting for elite secrets. What happened in the slave markets revealed something even darker about Roman aristocratic values. Rome's slave markets operated publicly, in the Forum, and in specialized facilities throughout the city. Tens of thousands of human beings were bought and sold annually. The markets were regulated, taxed, and considered entirely normal commercial activity. What the public markets offered was general labor. Agricultural workers, domestic servants, craftsmen, laborers. The selection process for these slaves was straightforward. Buyers assessed physical condition, skills, and temperament. Prices reflected utility. Transactions were recorded for tax purposes. The elite did not buy their slaves in public markets. A parallel system existed for wealthy purchasers, operating through private dealers who specialized in what the Romans called delicia, delights. These were slaves selected for attributes beyond labor capacity: beauty, youth, specific physical characteristics, training in specific arts. The selection process for deliciae was conducted privately, away from public observation, with protocols that would have caused scandal if widely known. A dealer named Tyrrhenius became wealthy in the late Republic by specializing in deliciae procurement for elite clients. His business records, fragments of which survived in legal disputes after his death, reveal a sophisticated operation. Agents throughout the Mediterranean identified promising acquisitions. Subjects were purchased young and trained in specialized facilities. The training included what the records euphemistically call education in the arts of pleasing. Elite buyers would visit Tyrrhenius's private showrooms, where slaves were displayed in ways that emphasized the qualities being sold. The viewing process was hands-on. Buyers were encouraged to inspect thoroughly, to verify that the merchandise met their requirements. The slaves being inspected had no rights, no voice, no recourse. They were products being evaluated by consumers. A senator named Quintus Lutatius Catulus maintained a household famous for the beauty of its slaves. His contemporary Cicero made references to Catulus's domestic arrangements in terms that suggest more than aesthetic appreciation. The senator's collection was acquired through dealers like Tyrrhenius, selected according to criteria that had nothing to do with household management. The prices for deliciae vastly exceeded ordinary slave prices. A skilled agricultural worker might cost 2,000 sesterces. A beautiful youth with appropriate training might cost $200,000. The investment represented indicated the purpose. No one paid that premium for someone to clean floors. The training facilities where deliciae were prepared operated in legal ambiguity. What happened in them was not discussed in polite company. But their existence was acknowledged, their products were purchased, and their graduates populated the households of Rome's most respected families. What became of deliciae slaves as they aged reveals the system's full cruelty. Youth and beauty fade. Slaves purchased for these qualities lost their value rapidly. Some were resold at declining prices as their primary utility diminished. Some were freed, cast out of households with minimal resources to survive. Some simply disappeared from records, their fates unmentioned because mentioning them would require acknowledging what they had been purchased for originally. The children born to Delicia slaves faced particular complications. Roman law made children of slaves the property of their mother's owner. This meant that children fathered by elite men on their own slaves were themselves slaves, owned by their own fathers. Some such children were freed and acknowledged. Many more were sold, given away, or disposed of in ways that left no record. This brings us to one of Rome's darkest practices, one that elite families participated in while publicly condemning. Roman law permitted fathers to reject newborn children. A baby could be placed outside the household, exposed to the elements and whatever fate might follow. The practice was called expositio, and it was legal, common, and horrifying. Elite families practiced exposure primarily for daughters and for children born with visible defects. A son was valuable. He continued the family name, inherited property, participated in politics. A daughter required a dowry, and too many daughters could strain even wealthy families. The calculus was financial. Children who cost more than they contributed were not worth raising. The exposed children did not necessarily die. Slave traders knew where to find them. Abandoned infants, if they survived their first hours, became property of whoever collected them. The traders raised these foundlings specifically for the deliciae market. Children without family, without identity, without anyone to object to their treatment, were ideal raw material for training in whatever arts buyers required. A legal case from the 1st century concerns a woman who recognized her own daughter being sold in a slave market 20 years after exposing her. The daughter had been collected as an infant, raised by traders, trained for specific purposes, and was being offered for sale when her mother happened to attend the market. The legal question was whether the mother had any claim to her daughter. The court ruled she did not. Having abandoned the child, she had forfeited all parental rights. The daughter remained merchandise. Elite families participated in this system from both directions. They exposed unwanted children who entered the slave supply. They purchased slaves who had originated as exposed children from other families. The circularity was understood, but not discussed. The beautiful slave serving wine at a senator's dinner might be the biological child of the senator dining at the next couch. No one would acknowledge this possibility. No one would investigate. The system depended on deliberate ignorance. Augustus attempted to regulate exposure, concerned about population decline among Roman citizens. His laws encouraged child-rearing through tax benefits and penalties for childlessness. But the laws applied primarily to legitimate children of citizens. Exposure continued for slaves, for the poor, for anyone outside the protected categories. Archaeological evidence from Roman sites includes infant remains in locations inconsistent with normal burial practices, trash heaps, latrine pits, drainage systems. These locations suggest disposal rather than burial, abandonment rather than death from natural causes. The scale of remains indicates that exposure was not rare, but routine. Elite participation in exposure was masked by the involvement of intermediaries. Midwives handled the actual exposure. Slave traders handled the collection. The family patriarch simply made a decision and delegated implementation. His hands remained clean, his conscience remained unburdened. The child simply disappeared, becoming someone else's problem, someone else's property, someone else's product. The exposed children who survived into slavery faced fates determined by their physical development. Those deemed attractive enough entered the deletiate track. Those deemed unsuitable for that market became ordinary labor slaves. Either fate originated in a parental decision that treated children as commodities to be evaluated, retained, or discarded based on expected value. But exposure was passive cruelty. What elite families did actively to eliminate rivals and enemies involved far more deliberate methods. Every elite Roman household contained poisons. This was practical rather than sinister. Rat poison, pest control, medical compounds that could kill in wrong doses. The presence of toxic substances was normal. What was not normal, but was pervasive, was the sophisticated poison networks that connected elite households through shared knowledge of how to use these substances against human targets. The Roman elite murdered each other with poison frequently enough that it became almost expected. A wealthy man dying suddenly in apparent health triggered immediate suspicion. His food tasters were interrogated. His slaves were tortured for information. His heirs were examined for motive. The assumption of poisoning was so common that natural deaths were often disbelieved. A woman named Locusta became Rome's most famous poisoner during the reign of Nero. She prepared the mushrooms that killed the Emperor Claudius, and the poison that killed Britannicus. But Locusta was only the most famous practitioner of an art that pervaded elite society. Her skills were exceptional. Her willingness to use them was entirely typical. Elite women were particularly associated with poison knowledge. Medical preparation was considered a feminine domestic art. The same skills that produced healing compounds could produce lethal ones. A matron who understood herbs well enough to treat her family's illnesses understood them well enough to end inconvenient lives. The poet Juvenal wrote satirically about Roman wives poisoning husbands, portraying it as so common that men should expect it. The satire worked because it reflected recognized reality. Marriage in elite Rome was a dangerous institution for wealthy men whose wives might benefit from their deaths. Inheritance provided the primary motive. Roman women could own property and could inherit from husbands. A wife who outlived her husband gained control of his estate, at least temporarily. Multiple marriages were common among elite women, each ending conveniently when the husband's wealth had been secured. A woman named Sassia was prosecuted in 79 years before Christ for allegedly poisoning multiple husbands. The prosecution was led by Cicero, whose speech against her provides detailed evidence of how poison networks operated. Sassia allegedly consulted specialists, obtained compounds through intermediaries, tested dosages on slaves, and administered fatal doses through contaminated food and drink. Whether Sassia was actually guilty remains uncertain. What is certain is that the network Cicero described, the specialists and intermediaries and testing protocols, existed and was accessible to anyone with money and connections. Sassia was prosecuted because she was caught. Others who were more careful were never prosecuted at all. The poison networks crossed household boundaries through shared servants and shared suppliers. A slave purchased from one elite household and resold to another might carry knowledge of what had happened in the first household. Suppliers who provided compounds to one family knew who else was buying. The information was valuable and was traded accordingly. Elite families protected themselves through elaborate precautions. Food tasters tested every dish. Trusted slaves guarded food preparation. Cups were kept locked when not in use. The precautions themselves demonstrated awareness of the threat. When everyone assumes poison is possible, everyone must defend against it. The normalization of poison as an elite tool extended to political applications. Rivals for office sometimes died conveniently. Witnesses to crimes sometimes failed to testify. The suspicion of poisoning was so pervasive that it shaped political behavior. Alliances were formed partly on the calculation of who might poison whom. But poison was merely one tool for eliminating problems. Elite Romans had access to methods that were crueler and more deliberate. Roman law granted patres familias, male heads of households, absolute power over their families and slaves. This power included the right to punish without external oversight. What happened within household walls was literally no one else's business. The punishments inflicted in elite households ranged from beating, which was routine, to torture, which was common, to killing, which was legal if the victim was a slave. The lamprey pond of Vedius Pollio was unusual only in its theatrical nature. Other households maintained their own facilities for punishing slaves, facilities that served purposes beyond mere discipline. A letter from Pliny the Younger describes visiting a friend's villa and hearing sounds from a wing of the house that the host dismissed as domestic matters. The sounds, Pliny notes without elaboration, continued throughout the evening. The host seemed entirely unconcerned. Other guests ignored what they heard. Pliny himself mentions it only in passing, as though unremarkable. What happened in those private spaces was sometimes discipline, but was sometimes entertainment. The line between punishment and pleasure blurred in ways that Roman sources discuss obliquely. Seneca condemns men who find satisfaction in applying the whip themselves rather than delegating to professionals. His condemnation reveals what it condemns: elite Romans personally inflicting pain on slaves for reasons beyond maintaining household order. The training of punishment specialists was a recognized profession. These professionals knew anatomy well enough to maximize pain without causing death. They knew psychology well enough to break resistance efficiently. They moved between elite households, sharing techniques, comparing methods, refining their art. Their services were purchased like any other skilled labor. Elite women participated in household punishments in ways that sources describe with evident discomfort. Juvenal satirizes matrons who supervise beatings with excessive interest, who specify methods, who observe results with visible satisfaction. The satire reveals the reality it mocks. Roman women of the highest social status personally oversaw the torture of household slaves. A case from the reign of Nero concerned a senator's wife who had killed a slave girl through prolonged punishment. The legal question was not whether she had the right to kill the slave, which she did, but whether her methods had violated public decency by occurring over multiple days with specific techniques that the court declined to describe explicitly. She was acquitted. Her methods remained legal. But the case record suggests practices that extended far beyond ordinary discipline. The private punishment facilities in elite villas have been identified archaeologically. Rooms with specific features, hooks in walls at particular heights, drains positioned for cleaning, soundproofing construction, all indicate purposes that architecture reveals even when written records do not. What makes these practices particularly disturbing is their combination with public virtue. The same senators who tortured slaves at home voted on laws governing public morality. The same matrons who supervised agonies in their households were celebrated for their domestic virtue. The dissonance was not experienced as contradiction because slaves were not considered fully human. What was done to them did not count as doing anything to anyone. But elite Romans did not restrict their transgressive activities to those they owned. What they did to each other, in specific ritual contexts, was equally hidden and equally disturbing. Roman religion was public and political. Temples stood in city centers. Priests held official positions. Ceremonies occurred on published calendars. The gods were civic institutions as much as spiritual forces. But alongside official religion existed mystery cults, initiatory religions with secret practices known only to members. The most famous were the Eleusinian mysteries from Greece, but dozens of others operated throughout the Roman world. Elite Romans participated in these cults while publicly maintaining traditional religious observances. What happened in mystery cult rituals was never supposed to be revealed. Initiates took oaths of secrecy enforced by divine punishment. Those who revealed mysteries faced death, both from the gods and from fellow initiates. The secrecy was remarkably effective. After centuries of practice involving thousands of initiates, the specific details of most mystery rituals remain unknown. But fragments have survived. References in court cases, accusations from Christian writers, archaeological evidence from cult sites. Enough survives to indicate that mystery rituals involved experiences that elite Romans could not acknowledge publicly. The cult of Dionysus, Greek god of wine and ecstasy, spread to Rome and was brutally suppressed in 186 years before Christ. The suppression was political, aimed at breaking up organizations that operated outside state control. But the charges used to justify suppression reveal what the cult allegedly practiced. Nocturnal gatherings where normal social boundaries dissolved, where participants of both genders engaged in acts that violated Roman moral codes, where the distinction between citizen and slave temporarily disappeared. The suppression killed thousands, but did not eliminate mystery cults. They continued operating more discreetly, their membership drawn increasingly from elite families whose social position provided protection that ordinary initiates lacked. A senator charged with cult participation could call on powerful friends. A common citizen faced the full weight of laws that officially prohibited these practices. The cult of Isis, Egyptian goddess of magic and mystery, attracted particularly elite participation. Temples to Isis operated in Rome despite periodic suppression. The initiates included senators, their wives, and members of the imperial family itself. What happened in Isis rituals involved what sources describe as all-night ceremonies from which participants emerged transformed. A satirist named Apuleius wrote a novel, The Golden Ass, that concludes with detailed description of Isis initiation. The protagonist undergoes rituals that bring him to the boundary of death and return. He sees visions. He experiences ecstasy. He is reborn as a devotee of the goddess. The description is compelling, but carefully stops short of revealing actual ritual content, maintaining the secrecy even while describing initiation's emotional power. What archaeologists have found at mystery cult sites suggests physical experiences beyond symbolic ritual, specialized chambers for isolation, apparatus for creating sensory effects, residue of substances that would have altered consciousness. The initiatory experience was not merely theatrical. It involved genuine alterations of perception achieved through methods that made the divine seem present and real. Elite participation in mystery cults served social functions beyond spiritual seeking. The shared secret created bonds among initiates that crossed normal social boundaries. A senator and a merchant who had undergone initiation together shared something that neither could acknowledge publicly, but both would remember. The cult network became another layer of elite connection, operating alongside, but separate from official political structures. The Christian writers who eventually dominated Roman culture condemned mystery cults as demonic. Their condemnations revealed details that initiates had kept hidden for centuries. The physical practices, the boundary violations, the things done in darkness that could not be done in light. The Christian eagerness to expose pagan depravity ensures that we know something of what mystery cults involved, even if the full picture remains incomplete. But mystery cults were episodic experiences. What elite Roman women did on an ongoing basis with specific partners was an open secret that everyone knew and no one discussed. Gladiators occupied a strange position in Roman society. They were slaves or criminals, the lowest social categories. But successful gladiators became celebrities, their names known throughout the city, their images reproduced on household items, their fights anticipated with the excitement modern audiences reserve for championship sports. Elite Roman women found gladiators fascinating. This fascination is documented extensively in sources that range from poetry to graffiti to legal records. The fascination went far beyond appreciation of athletic prowess. It was physical, intimate, and acted upon. A wife of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, was rumored to have taken a gladiator as lover. The rumor held that the future emperor Commodus was actually the gladiator's son, which supposedly explained Commodus's later obsession with fighting in the arena himself. Whether the rumor was true matters less than the fact that it was widely believed. Elite women taking gladiator lovers was plausible enough that Romans accepted the story. Juvenal dedicated an entire section of his satires to matrons who abandoned their families to follow gladiators. He names specific women, describes specific affairs, and condemns the willing degradation of elite status for physical involvement with slaves. His condemnation reveals what was being condemned, a pattern of behavior widespread enough to warrant extended satirical treatment. The gladiator schools, where fighters trained, became sites of elite female attention. Women found ways to visit, to watch training, to make contact with fighters who attracted their interest. The school owners facilitated these arrangements for appropriate compensation. A successful gladiator could supplement his prize money significantly through elite patronage that extended beyond mere financial support. Graffiti preserved at Pompeii includes what can only be called fan messages for gladiators, expressing interest in explicitly physical terms. Some of this graffiti was clearly written by women. The gladiator named Celadus is described as making girls sigh, heartthrob of the girls, and similar phrases that indicate female enthusiasm extending beyond admiration of fighting skill. The arrangement of gladiator encounters required discretion, but not impossibility. Elite women had mobility. They controlled household resources. They could arrange absences and create opportunities. Gladiators, despite their low status, had access to women that men of higher status might envy. The paradox was understood and exploited. The children born from these unions faced particular complications. A child of an elite woman was legally her husband's, regardless of actual paternity. A man might find himself raising children who obviously did not resemble him, unable to acknowledge the truth without publicly shaming himself. The legal system that made legitimate children valuable also made it impossible to discard children whose legitimacy was doubtful. Some elite men responded to this threat with violence. A senator during Domitian's reign allegedly killed his wife and the gladiator he found her with, claiming the traditional right of husbands to avenge dishonor. He was acquitted. The case established that elite men could respond lethally to wives' involvement with gladiators, which suggests how frequently such involvement occurred. But the gladiator obsession was merely the most visible form of elite women's sexual autonomy. What happened at the public baths revealed patterns that affected Romans of all genders. Roman baths were architectural marvels, public facilities that provided hot and cold bathing, exercise, massage, and socialization. They were also sites of activities that Romans simultaneously practiced and condemned. The baths operated with minimal clothing and significant gender mixing during certain hours. Male and female sections existed, but movement between them was possible. Private rooms were available for rent. The combination of physical exposure, relaxed atmosphere, and private spaces created opportunities that bath owners exploited and bath users enjoyed. A poet named Martial writes repeatedly about what happens in baths, in poems that require careful reading to understand fully. He references women who spend excessive time in mixed bathing hours. He mentions men who visit baths for purposes beyond hygiene. He describes encounters in private rooms that would be impossible to arrange elsewhere. The baths employed slaves whose duties extended beyond towel provision. Bath attendants included young men and women selected for attractiveness, available for services that supplemented the standard bath experience. Elite patrons could request specific attendance. The requests were understood, the services were provided, the arrangement was commercial but disguised as hospitality. Certain baths became known for specific clientelas. One establishment might attract those seeking partners of a particular type. Another might be known for discretion, suitable for married patrons who wished to avoid recognition. The specialization was not advertised, but was communicated through networks that those seeking such information knew how to access. The Emperor Hadrian attempted to regulate bath behavior by mandating separate hours for men and women. The regulation was widely ignored. It was also repeatedly reimposed by subsequent emperors, suggesting that compliance was never achieved. The baths remained spaces where Roman moral codes were suspended, where things happened that could not happen in other public venues. The health justifications for bathing provided cover for activities that had nothing to do with health. A matron who spent hours at the baths daily could not easily be questioned. She was maintaining her health, following medical advice, participating in normal Roman social life. What she did during those hours, whom she met, what occurred in private rooms, this was her business and not subject to inquiry. Elite households included private bath facilities, but many elite Romans preferred public baths for precisely the opportunities they offered. The public setting provided anonymity that private bathing could not. Encounters with strangers carried less risk than encounters with members of one's own social circle. The democracy of the baths, where wealth mattered less than physical presence, attracted elites seeking experiences their status normally prevented. Archaeological evidence from Roman baths includes rooms whose purposes are evident from their design. Small chambers with locking doors, positioned away from main circulation areas, equipped with amenities suggesting extended occupation. These were not changing rooms. They were accommodation for activities that required privacy and time. But while the baths offered opportunities for all Romans, elite families maintained exclusive practices in their country properties that no public facility could match. Rome itself was crowded, surveilled, and constrained by social expectations. Elite families escaped to country villas, where distance from the city meant distance from observation. What happened at these villas was protected by isolation, by loyal slaves, and by the shared understanding among neighboring estate owners that everyone's privacy served everyone's interests. The Bay of Naples attracted particular concentration of elite villas. Dozens of properties lined the coast, owned by Rome's wealthiest families, staffed by hundreds of slaves, designed for entertainment that urban properties could not accommodate. The proximity meant that elite families could visit each other, share resources, and combine for events that no single household could manage alone. A villa discovered at Oplontis, buried by Vesuvius in 79, revealed architecture designed for purposes beyond simple residence, hidden rooms accessible through concealed passages, bathing facilities with unusual arrangements, wall paintings depicting scenes that archaeologists initially declined to publish. The villa's owner was connected to the imperial family. The villa's design suggests entertainment of types that required both space and secrecy. The notorious villa at Sperlonga, owned by the Emperor Tiberius, featured a dining grotto built into coastal cliffs. The grotto contained elaborate sculptural groups and a circular pool where diners reclined on platforms extending into water. The arrangement created an atmosphere that ancient sources describe as conducive to every excess. Diners were surrounded by mythological scenes of metamorphosis and passion. They were isolated from the world above. They could indulge whatever the setting suggested. Private correspondence from the late Republic includes references to villa entertainments using language that requires interpretation. An invitation to spend a week at a friend's villa and enjoy full hospitality implied more than comfortable accommodation. The phrase known delights indicated that specific amenities, human amenities, would be available. The coded language allowed communication while maintaining deniability. The slave populations at these villas were selected differently than urban household slaves. Physical beauty was prioritized. Training emphasized entertainment skills. The ratio of attractive young slaves to practical workers far exceeded what agricultural or domestic needs would justify. The villa's slave complement was effectively a private collection of human beings selected for pleasure rather than productivity. What occurred during villa parties was occasionally revealed through legal proceedings when arrangements went wrong. A case from Cicero's time involved a young Roman citizen who had been drugged at a villa party and subjected to treatment normally reserved for slaves. His family's prosecution revealed aspects of villa entertainment that the defendant's lawyers argued were common practice, merely unfortunate in this instance, because the victim happened to possess citizenship rights. The villa culture created spaces where Roman elite could escape not only observation but their own identities. Away from Rome, away from formal social roles, surrounded only by slaves and fellow elites who would never speak publicly about what they witnessed, the wealthy could explore desires that urban life constrained. The villas were laboratories for appetite, maintained at enormous expense precisely because they enabled what could not be enabled elsewhere. But not all elite secrets required physical isolation. Some operated openly in Rome itself, disguised by religious or theatrical framing that made transgression appear legitimate. Roman theater existed in complex relationship with Roman morality. Actors were legally infamous, stripped of citizen rights, ranked alongside prostitutes in legal status. Yet, theater was public entertainment supported by state funds, attended by all classes, featuring performances that ranged from legitimate drama to displays that amounted to public intimacy. The mimes and pantomimes that dominated late Roman theater featured physical performance that pushed boundaries of what could be displayed publicly. Performers appeared minimally clothed or unclothed entirely. Performances simulated or actually depicted intimate acts. The audience watched what could not be done elsewhere, sanctioned by theatrical context. Elite involvement with theater extended beyond attendance. Wealthy patrons supported acting companies, providing financing in exchange for access to performers. The access was understood to include personal access, private performances, arrangements that satisfied appetites beyond aesthetic appreciation. A genre of theatrical entertainment called fabula atellana featured obscene humor and explicit situations performed by actors whose legal status made them available for whatever patrons desired. Elite homes hosted private performances of these plays, modified for intimate venues, adjusted for the specific interests of the host and guests. The Emperor Nero famously performed in public theaters, scandalizing traditionalists who believed imperial dignity incompatible with acting. But Nero was only the most visible elite theatrical participant. Others preferred private performances where they could take roles that public theater reserved for the infamous. The theatrical framework provided psychological distance. One was not actually doing these things. One was performing them, playing a part, participating in art. The child performers who appeared in Roman theaters faced particular vulnerabilities. Theater companies included children, trained from early ages in performance skills that encompassed more than acting. Elite patrons showed interest in specific child performers. The companies accommodated these interests for appropriate compensation. The children had no voice in these arrangements. They were property, belonging to companies whose income depended on satisfying patron desires. A legal case from the 2nd century concerned a father who sold his son to a theatrical company and later sought to recover him. The court proceedings revealed that the son had been assigned duties beyond performance, duties that the father claimed he had not authorized. The court ruled that the sale had transferred complete rights to the company. What the company did with its property was not subject to the original seller's objections. The theatrical culture created a space where Roman moral codes were officially suspended. What happened on stage was not real. What happened backstage was not public. What happened between patrons and performers was private arrangement between owner and property. The theater provided systematic access to experiences that Roman law theoretically prohibited, but theatrical convention practically enabled. But theatrical arrangements served elite interests occasionally. What wealthy Romans imported from conquered territories served those interests continuously. Rome conquered the Mediterranean world and absorbed its practices. From Egypt, from Syria, from Asia Minor, from dozens of other conquered regions, came customs and traditions and vices that transformed Roman elite culture. The Eastern imports included human beings, selected specifically for characteristics that Roman slave dealers knew elite buyers would pay premium prices for. Egypt supplied boys trained in arts that Egyptian temples had refined over millennia. Syria supplied girls whose preparation included techniques that Syrian traditions had developed. Each conquered region contributed its specialties to an imperial market that combined them all. A dealer in the 1st century specialized in what he called Eastern delights, slaves from conquered territories who had been trained in their homelands before transport to Rome. His marketing emphasized the exotic, the different, the techniques unknown to Italian slaves. Elite buyers paid extraordinary prices for the promise of experiences their Roman possessions could not provide. The conquered peoples brought their gods as well, and their rituals. The cult of Cybele from Asia Minor featured priests who had castrated themselves in ecstatic ceremony. The cult of Astarte from Syria involved temple practices that Romans found simultaneously horrifying and fascinating. These religions attracted elite initiates who sought experiences that Roman traditions did not offer. The Eastern influence on elite intimate practices can be traced through vocabulary. Latin acquired terms from Greek, Syrian, and Egyptian languages for acts and arrangements that Latin had previously lacked words to describe. The linguistic borrowing indicates cultural borrowing. Romans learned practices from their conquered subjects and needed new words to discuss them. A satirist from the 2nd century mocks elite Romans who travel to Alexandria, specifically to learn what Alexandria teaches about pleasure. The mockery reveals the travel pattern. Wealthy Romans visited Egypt not only for tourism, but for education in arts that Egyptian civilization had systematized. They returned to Rome with knowledge, with trained slaves, with equipment, with appetites expanded by exposure to possibilities they had not previously imagined. The Eastern imports transformed Roman elite culture across centuries. By the late Empire, practices that early Romans would have considered foreign perversions had become normalized among the wealthy. The consumption of conquered cultures included consumption of their approaches to intimacy, their trained specialists, their accumulated knowledge of pleasure and its techniques. This importation operated through networks that connected elite households across the Mediterranean. A wealthy Roman in Antioch might acquire slaves or knowledge that would be shipped to relatives in Rome. A merchant traveling for business might fulfill special commissions for elite patrons seeking particular imports. The networks ensured that whatever one conquered territory offered would become available throughout the Roman elite world. But not all elite secrets involved pleasure. Some involved the darker rituals that surrounded death itself. Roman funerals for elite families were elaborate public spectacles, processions through city streets, ancestor masks displayed, eulogies delivered in the forum. The death of a prominent Roman was a community event, witnessed by thousands, recorded in histories, commemorated through monuments. What happened in private, before and after the public funeral, followed different patterns. The preparation of bodies was conducted by specialized professionals, many of them slaves, whose work required intimate handling of corpses. The embalmers and dressers who prepared elite dead were selected for their discretion as much as their skill. What they saw and what they did was never discussed publicly. Certain practices around elite death appear in sources that mention them only to condemn or deny them. The preservation of specific body parts as relics. The consultation of the dead through rituals that required physical access to remains. The treatment of corpses in ways that violated official religious prohibitions against disturbing the dead. A scandal during Tiberius's reign involved accusations that an elite family had desecrated an enemy's corpse after his execution. The specific desecrations were deemed too disturbing to record fully, but the court proceedings reveal that the family had retained the body for private treatment before permitting public burial. What happened during that retention was apparently extreme enough to warrant prosecution despite the family's status. The funeral feasts that followed burial extended Roman dining practices into mourning context. Sources suggest that these feasts sometimes included activities that the deceased would have enjoyed, recreated as tribute or as continuation. The funeral feast for a man known for particular appetites might include those appetites as part of the commemoration. The memorial practices at elite tombs went beyond simple offerings of food and wine. Certain tombs included facilities for activities that simple remembrance would not require. The tomb of the freedman Eurysaces, a baker, included an elaborate dining area. Other tombs included chambers whose purposes remain debated, but whose designs suggest private activities rather than public commemoration. The cult of dead ancestors that permeated Roman religion created intimate connections between living and dead that operated differently than modern sensibilities expect. Ancestors were present in the household. Their images looked down from walls. Their approval was sought for major decisions. The physical remains of ancestors, preserved in household shrines or family tombs, were objects of ongoing relationship rather than simply memorial. Elite families maintained these relationships through practices that sources describe vaguely: consultations with the dead, rituals at tombs that required privacy, treatments of remains that kept ancestors physically present in ways that official religion did not sanction. The practices were hidden because they violated public norms. They persisted because they satisfied needs that public religion did not meet. But funeral practices affected the dead. What elite Romans did with the living, who were not quite family, represented another category of hidden behavior. Elite Roman households typically included children who were not biological offspring of the family. Foster children, alumni, occupied an ambiguous status between family member and slave. They were raised with the family's children, educated similarly, but lacked inheritance rights and legal protections that legitimate children possessed. The selection of alumni followed patterns that sources acknowledge obliquely. Beautiful children were preferred. Specific physical characteristics mattered. The children were acquired young, raised in intimacy with the family, and served purposes that their ambiguous status facilitated. A letter from Pliny the Younger mourns the death of a young alumna from his household. His grief seems genuine and excessive for someone who was not family. He describes her beauty, her charm, her physical development. The letter reveals affection that later centuries would find disturbing, affection for a child whose presence in his household was not explained by family relationship. The alumnus system provided elite households with children who were available in ways that legitimate children were not. They could be given away, sold, or disposed of without the legal complications attending actual offspring. They could be used in arrangements that family honor would not permit for biological children. Their intermediate status made them useful precisely because it denied them the protections that status conferred. What became of alumni as they matured varied by household and by individual. Some were freed and established in independent life. Some were married to other alumni, or to slaves in arrangements the family orchestrated. Some simply disappear from records as they aged out of whatever utility had motivated their acquisition. A legal case from the late Republic concerned an alumnus who claimed he had been promised freedom and citizenship upon reaching adulthood. The family denied any such promise. The case revealed that the alumnus had served the household in capacities that went beyond normal domestic duties, capacities that the family's lawyers argued were appropriate given his unfree status. The court ruled for the family. The alumnus remained property. The alumni children were visible in elite households, but invisible in discussion. Everyone knew they existed. Everyone understood their ambiguous position. No one discussed what that position actually entailed. The silence protected the families who benefited from the system and exposed the children whom the system used. Elite Romans justified the alumnus system through the language of charity. They were rescuing children who would otherwise face worse fates. They were providing education and opportunity. They were acting as benefactors to those who could not benefit themselves. The justification obscured exploitation behind benevolence, making criticism seem ungrateful for generosity rather than appropriate to abuse. But even the alumni had defined positions. What elite Romans did to those entirely outside protection revealed the system's full capacity for cruelty. Roman criminal law permitted punishments that served entertainment purposes. Criminals condemned to death could be killed in ways that provided spectacle for public audiences. The fusion of justice and entertainment created opportunities that elite Romans exploited beyond public arenas. The damnati ad bestias, condemned to the beasts, were criminals sentenced to die through animal attack in the arena. Elite Romans could purchase condemned criminals for private entertainments that replicated arena deaths on a smaller scale. The legal transfer was simple. The criminal had been condemned to death by a specific method, providing that death privately rather than publicly remained within legal parameters. Private beast fights occurred at elite villas where criminals were provided to wild animals for the entertainment of dinner guests. The accounts suggest that these private spectacles allowed elaborations that public arenas constrained. The criminals could be prepared in specific ways, could face animals selected for particular characteristics, could die in sequences designed for maximum impact on intimate audiences. The sexual dimension of arena violence is documented in sources that discuss it with evident discomfort. Criminals were sometimes subjected to intimate assaults before or during their deaths. The combination of violence and violation created spectacles that public arenas could not openly display, but that private venues could stage without restriction. A fragment from a legal commentator discusses the question of whether a criminal condemned to death can be subjected to treatment beyond the sentence imposed. The discussion reveals that such treatment routinely occurred. The commentator's concern is not whether it happens, but whether it is technically legal. His conclusion is that once condemned, a criminal has no remaining rights. Whatever is done before or during execution is within the condemning authority's discretion. Elite patrons commission specific deaths for their entertainments. A criminal might be costumed to represent a mythological figure and killed in a manner matching the myth. The staging required planning, resources, and creative vision. The deaths became performances, scripts written by wealthy patrons and enacted on condemned bodies. The children of criminals could be sold into slavery when their parents were executed. Elite buyers acquired these children knowing their origins, sometimes because of their origins. The children of traitors, of murderers, of enemies, provided a particular satisfaction when owned by those who had engineered their parents' downfall. The possession was a trophy. The child's service was an ongoing victory. This system operated through intermediaries, who insulated elite patrons from direct involvement. Agents attended auctions. Dealers provided specific acquisitions. The patron's hands remained clean. The patron's entertainment was provided. The system's efficiency ensured that elite desires found satisfaction within legal frameworks that nominally prohibited what actually occurred. But legal entertainment was merely one dimension of elite transgression. What wealthy Romans did through their political influence exceeded what they did through commercial transactions. Roman politics operated through personal relationships rather than institutional processes. Alliances were sealed through arrangements that extended beyond policy agreement. The favor trading that characterized elite politics included favors that would not be mentioned in speeches or recorded in histories. The sharing of intimate resources cemented political alliances. A senator seeking another senator's support might provide access to household members whose availability demonstrated trust and created mutual vulnerability. The exchange created bonds stronger than mere political agreement. Both parties had compromised themselves in ways that made betrayal dangerous. A speech by Cicero attacking his enemy Clodius references arrangements of this type without describing them explicitly. Cicero accuses Clodius of using his own sister in political negotiations, providing her to allies whose support he needed. The accusation was scandalous enough that Cicero assumed his audience would understand the implications. Clodius's political success, the accusation suggests, was built partly on his willingness to deploy family members in arrangements that more honorable men would refuse. The political marriages that united elite families were explicitly transactional. Daughters were assigned to husbands whose political value to their fathers outweighed any consideration of the daughters' preferences or welfare. The daughters understood their function. They were diplomatic instruments, their bodies sealing alliances that their father's words could not adequately guarantee. What happened within these political marriages depended on the individuals involved. Some developed genuine partnership. Others remained functional hostility, spouses who fulfilled public duties while pursuing private interests separately. The political purpose having been served, the marriage itself mattered less than the alliance it symbolized. The political use of intimate scandal as weapon was systematic. Elite Romans gathered information about rivals' private conduct, holding it in reserve for deployment when political circumstances warranted. The information was obtained through slaves who reported household activities, through observers at private entertainments, through the networks of information that permeated elite society. A politician whose private conduct could not withstand exposure was vulnerable to rivals who possessed evidence. The threat of exposure could compel policy concessions, could force withdrawal from competitions, could end careers without requiring actual disclosure. The weapon was more effective held in reserve than used openly. Everyone knew the threats existed. Everyone calculated their vulnerability. The political dimension transformed private conduct into public liability. What a senator did in his own household became potential ammunition for enemies. The surveillance was mutual. Everyone watched everyone else. Everyone gathered information. Everyone recognized that their own conduct was being similarly observed and recorded. This mutual surveillance might have constrained behavior. Instead, it created collective vulnerability. Everyone had secrets. Everyone knew others' secrets. The mutual exposure created a kind of stability. No one could expose others without risking exposure themselves. The result was not virtue, but silent complicity, an elite bound together by shared transgression that none could acknowledge without acknowledging their own. But not all elite secrets were systematically hidden. Some were known to everyone and simply never mentioned directly. Every Roman of elite status knew things that were never written down, the identities of children whose paternity differed from their official parentage, the arrangements that explained unexpected political alliances, the reasons certain families avoided each other at public events, the explanations for sudden changes in fortune that official accounts attributed to chance. These open secrets circulated through oral transmission, passed from parent to child, from patron to client, from friend to friend. They constituted a shadow history that supplemented the official record, explaining what written sources left unexplained, filling gaps that formal histories could not acknowledge. The slave who killed the senator Lucius Pedanius in the 1st century was publicly unknown in motive. The entire slave household 400 people, was executed according to Roman law that held all slaves responsible when one killed a master. But elite Romans knew why the slave had killed, understood the provocation that had driven him to fatal action. The knowledge circulated through conversations that left no record. The public mystery was private certainty. Elite women were particularly custodians of open secrets. They knew which marriages were genuine and which were facade. They knew the real relationships behind public displays. They knew which children resembled their official fathers and which did not. This knowledge was women's currency, traded among themselves, deployed in the subtle competitions that elite women conducted parallel to their husbands' public conflicts. The open secrets included knowledge of practices that could not be discussed in any other form. Everyone knew which senators had particular preferences. Everyone knew which matrons made particular arrangements. Everyone knew which families maintained particular establishments. The knowledge was universal. The silence was equally universal. Speaking openly about open secrets violated norms more fundamental than the secrets themselves. A man named Publius Clodius was notoriously discovered at a women-only religious ceremony, the rites of the Bona Dea, in 62 years before Christ. His presence was sacrilege. His motive, according to the open secret everyone knew, was pursuit of Julius Caesar's wife Pompeia. The subsequent trial and acquittal were public events. The actual arrangement between Clodius and Pompeia, and its continuation despite the scandal, remained open secret that everyone knew and no one stated. The open secret system served social functions beyond simple gossip. It created graduated levels of inclusion. Those who knew particular secrets were insiders. Those who did not were outsiders. The knowledge itself became currency, traded for other knowledge, used to establish relationships and demonstrate trustworthiness. A man who could be trusted with secrets could be trusted with other confidences. The secrets were tests of reliability. Elite Romans learned to navigate this system from childhood. They learned what could be said and what could only be known. They learned to communicate through implication rather than statement. They learned that words had two meanings, the surface meaning available to everyone, and the deeper meaning available only to those who understood the context of open secrets. The system continues in modified forms wherever elites operate. The modern gossip networks that circulate information about powerful people, the knowledge that insiders share about public figures' private conduct, the gap between official biography and understood reality, all these echo the Roman open secret system. Power generates secrets. Secrets generate solidarity among those who share them. The dynamics are constant across cultures and centuries. This brings us to the final secret, the one that encompasses all others. The Roman elite tried to destroy evidence of their own conduct. This is the final secret, the one that explains why so much has been lost and why what survives appears in fragments, rather than complete accounts. The destruction was systematic and deliberate. Private letters were burned by recipients who understood their incriminating potential. Household records were purged when families faced political difficulties. Slaves who knew too much were sold to distant provinces or simply disappeared. The infrastructure of secrecy extended to the destruction of evidence that secrecy might fail to protect. When Christianity became Rome's official religion in the 4th century, the new authorities conducted additional destruction. Texts that revealed pagan elite conduct were targeted as both immoral and irreligious. The combination of moral outrage and theological mandate produced comprehensive purges of written material that had survived centuries of previous erasure. What survives does so accidentally. The texts that Vesuvius buried at Pompeii and Herculaneum escaped the purges that destroyed their copies elsewhere. The graffiti on walls was too trivial to warrant destruction and too permanent to remove easily. The legal records were preserved for their procedural value. their incriminating content apparently overlooked by those who maintained archives. The archaeology of destruction itself tells stories. Villa sites where specific rooms were dismantled before abandonment. Archives where burn layers indicate deliberate destruction rather than accidental fire. Tombs whose original inscriptions were erased and replaced. The physical evidence of erasure reveals how important concealment was to those who practiced it. The destruction continued after antiquity. Medieval monks who copied classical texts sometimes declined to copy sections they deemed too offensive. Their selectivity further reduced what survived. Renaissance scholars who rediscovered classical material sometimes suppressed what they found, judging certain texts too dangerous for circulation. Each generation of transmission provided opportunity for additional erasure. What we know about Roman elite conduct comes from material that escaped multiple generations of deliberate destruction. The survivors are fragments, hints, implications that require scholarly reconstruction to become coherent narratives. The full picture is permanently lost. The darkness into which the destroyed evidence vanished will never be illuminated. This erasure itself constitutes evidence. The systematic effort to destroy records of elite conduct proves that there was something worth destroying. The comprehensiveness of the destruction proves that the conduct was not isolated incidents, but pervasive patterns. The persistence of destruction across centuries proves that what was being hidden was understood to be damaging across changing cultural contexts. The Roman elite knew what they were doing. They knew it violated their own professed standards. They knew that evidence of their conduct would damage their reputations and their families' positions. They invested enormous effort in concealment while they lived, and in erasure after they died. The investment proves the value they placed on hiding what they had done. What survives despite this effort represents only a fraction of what existed. For every scandal we know about, dozens were successfully hidden. For every practice we can document, others were concealed effectively enough that no evidence remains. The fragments we possess are glimpses through gaps in a curtain that was mostly successful in hiding what lay behind it. This is why these stories matter. Not because they represent complete knowledge of Roman elite conduct, because they represent the incomplete knowledge that survived, despite comprehensive efforts at erasure. If this is what escaped, imagine what did not. You have now heard 17 categories of Roman elite secrets that ancient sources documented despite systematic erasure. The question that remains is what this history means for understanding human society more broadly. The Roman elite were not uniquely corrupt. They were typically corrupt, in ways that recur whenever a class possesses wealth and power without accountability. The specific practices vary by culture and technology. The underlying patterns, the exploitation of the powerless, the private conduct contradicting public virtue, the systematic concealment of what concealment cannot morally rehabilitate. These patterns appear in every aristocracy that historians have studied. The Roman evidence is valuable precisely because so much survived despite erasure. The Romans left more documentation than most ancient civilizations. Their empire's extent ensured that copies of texts existed in multiple locations, some of which escaped destruction. Their cultural influence on subsequent civilizations ensured continued interest in their records. We know more about Roman elite conduct than we know about comparable elites elsewhere. This knowledge serves as template for recognizing patterns in other contexts. The slave market selections have parallels in every society that has practiced slavery. The poison networks have parallels in every aristocracy whose inheritance laws created incentives for murder. The private punishments have parallels wherever absolute authority over others has existed. The Roman evidence illuminates universal dynamics through specific examples. The erasure attempts themselves follow universal patterns. Every elite tries to hide what would damage its legitimacy. Every power structure invests in controlling its own narrative. The Roman efforts were more systematic and better documented than most, but they were not different in kind from efforts that continue today. Modern elites maintain privacy through legal mechanisms rather than slave loyalty and text destruction, but the underlying dynamic, the gap between public presentation and private conduct, persists. The powerful still have secrets. They still invest in concealing those secrets. They still face occasional exposure that reveals what concealment normally hides. The Roman sources that condemn elite conduct often did so for political rather than moral reasons. Cicero attacked Clodius because they were enemies, not because Cicero's own conduct was exemplary. Juvenal satirized elite women because satire sold, not because he was genuinely outraged. The moralistic framing of our sources should not obscure that the evidence they provide was generated by complex motivations. But the evidence remains valid regardless of why it was produced. A political enemy may have biased reasons for revealing secrets, but the secrets revealed are no less real for the bias. The Roman sources tell us what happened, even when their reasons for telling us were self-interested. The 17 secrets we have explored have contemporary relevance that extends beyond historical interest. Modern wealthy families still practice forms of selection in acquiring domestic workers, still maintain private spaces where conduct differs from public presentation, still use intermediaries to insulate themselves from direct involvement in questionable arrangements. The specific mechanisms differ from Roman slave markets and villa entertainments. The social dynamics that create desire for such mechanisms persist. Modern political arrangements still include intimate dimensions that participants conceal from public knowledge. The favor trading that characterizes elite politics still extends beyond policy into personal territory. The mutual vulnerability created by shared secrets still binds political allies more effectively than shared ideology. Modern erasure of inconvenient evidence continues through different technologies. Digital records can be deleted. Non-disclosure agreements can silence witnesses. Legal threats can suppress publication. The comprehensive destruction that Roman elites practiced has modern equivalents that serve identical purposes. The structural factors that enabled Roman elite conduct, concentration of wealth, legal impunity, ownership of other human beings, these have not disappeared, but have transformed. Extreme wealth concentration has returned to levels comparable to Roman inequality. Legal systems still provide more protection for the wealthy than for others. Human trafficking continues to provide victims for exploitation that differs in form, but not in essence, from Roman slavery. Understanding Roman elite secrets helps recognize their modern manifestations. The forms change, the patterns persist. A modern Vettius Pollio would not feed slaves to lampreys. He would find other expressions for the same impulses, expressions that his wealth would protect from consequence just as effectively as Roman wealth protected Roman cruelty. The silence that surrounded Roman elite conduct has modern parallels as well. The open secrets that everyone knew and no one stated directly exist in contemporary elite circles. The graduated knowledge that distinguishes insiders from outsiders continues to function. The currency of confidential information still purchases access and alliance. We began in the villa of Vettius Pollio, watching a slave named Demetrius dragged toward a pond filled with hungry eels because he had spilled 3 drops of wine. We have traveled through 17 categories of Roman elite secrets that reveal what wealth and power without accountability become. The Roman elite were not monsters. They were ordinary people, no better and no worse than elites throughout history, operating within systems that enabled their worst impulses while requiring them to maintain facades of virtue. Their public selves built monuments and wrote philosophy and governed an empire that shaped subsequent civilization. Their private selves did things that those monuments and philosophies and governance structures were designed to hide. The gap between public and private is where power's true nature becomes visible. What people do when they believe no one is watching, or when everyone watching is complicit, reveals what their public presentation conceals. The Roman elite believed they were unobserved. They were wrong. Fragments escaped. Witnesses recorded what they saw. Evidence accumulated despite erasure. The slaves who served elite households were the primary witnesses. Their testimony survives in glimpses, in records made when slaves were questioned about household matters for legal proceedings, in graffiti written by literate slaves who wanted someone to know what they had experienced. The voiceless were not completely silent. Their fragments contradict the official narratives that elite self-presentation produced. The women of elite households were secondary witnesses. They knew what happened in spaces designated for women. They knew what their husbands did and what they themselves did. Their knowledge surfaces in sources written by men who learned from women, who recorded what women told them, who preserved female perspectives despite cultural assumptions that women's knowledge was less valuable than men's. The Roman elite tried to control history. They built monuments to their public virtues. They commissioned histories that emphasized their contributions. They destroyed evidence of their private conduct. They almost succeeded. Almost. What survived is enough. Enough to recognize the patterns. Enough to understand the dynamics. Enough to see through facades that time and deliberate erasure have made incomplete but not invisible. The 17 secrets we have explored tonight are windows into a world that wanted to remain hidden. The world was not completely successful in hiding itself. Remember the slave Demetrius, whose minor accident nearly cost his life. Remember that the guest who saved him did so despite social pressure, despite the cost to himself, despite a system that told him his intervention was wrong. The guest's name was not recorded. His identity was not preserved, but his action was. Someone thought it was worth remembering that once someone said no. That no matters. It matters because it proves that even within systems of comprehensive exploitation, individuals could choose differently. It matters because it demonstrates that the conduct we have described was not inevitable, was not beyond objection, was not the only possibility. Romans themselves recognized that what elites did was wrong, even if most declined to say so. The Roman elite are gone. Their villas have crumbled. Their monuments stand empty. Their names are remembered primarily by historians and tourists. But what they showed about human nature remains relevant. The capacity for cruelty when power permits it. The hypocrisy of public virtue masking private vice. The systematic erasure of inconvenient truth. These are not Roman characteristics. They are human characteristics that Roman evidence illuminates with particular clarity. If you found this exploration valuable, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Share this video with anyone who thinks Roman civilization was simply marble monuments and senatorial debates. Comment below telling me what other historical secrets you want investigated. These stories matter because they reveal patterns that persist in modified forms today. These victims matter because their suffering was real and should not be erased simply because their oppressors wished it erased. These patterns matter because recognizing them in historical form helps identify them in contemporary manifestations. The fragments that survived Roman erasure speak across 2,000 years. They tell us what power without accountability becomes. They show us what wealth without restraint permits. They warn us about what happens when some humans are granted absolute authority over others. The warning is not ancient, it is eternal. See you in the next video, where we will continue uncovering the buried truths that those with power have always tried to hide and have never completely succeeded in hiding.